We are in a series about stories, and how you and I are living a story. We're not just entertained by story. Story isn't just a nice gift to humanity that entertains us once in a while or allows us to escape crisis or the stresses of life. Don't we say that sometimes about going to a movie theater or getting lost in a book? It's our escape. Actually, you're living a story. Whether you want to or whether this is intentional or not or conscious on your part, you are living out a story. Technically, by the structure of your life and with the content of your life. And your story is inextricably tied to God's story. In week 1, we talked about how of all the world religions, they all are presented by decrees and instructions and rules, except for the story of Jesus. The Christian story, the story of Jesus, is presented in story. It's very unique among all religions. Because God interacts with us through the entity, the experience of story. God has a story, and we are part of his story. Now, it's fascinating how our culture is so tied to story, we can't help it. Companies can't help it. The entertainment world can't help it. The way you interact with people at work, when you're catching up, you're often telling a story to coworkers on Monday mornings. You go into story mode. Some of our brands, Coca-Cola has used the tagline, "It's the story of us." When you drink a Coke, you're drinking the story of us. I don't even think they know what that means. What they do know is that story is so important to everyday life. Rolex, the company of timeless luxury, says a story that lasts a lifetime. There's exotic, expensive brands, and then there's just everyday brands. Pillsbury says to you and me, because every great recipe has a story. I think some of these things are really just funny. And I think if we did challenge the executive, what story does your recipe tell? I would love to hear their answer. What these companies know is that life, we innately know in life, in our everyday lives, that life is about stories. It's the currency of relationships. It's how humans really understand and relate to one another. It's through stories. I knew the number was big. I wanted to look up again the Harry Potter book sales. When you think about how busy we are, don't we say it all the time? Life is busy, we're so busy, and yet we have time for stories. Sometimes we get lost deep into series. Stories that are series. Harry Potter has sold over 600 million copies. Just one book. You think about the books, the millions of copies that are sold every year of various authors and books. So I want to look at a story this morning that relates to your story and mine, and it points to the story of Jesus. It's a foreshadow, deep in the Old Testament, a foreshadow of the story that would be Jesus, who would one day come. And it's the story of Moses. Now, I'm going to hit a short portion of Exodus chapter 1, then a portion of Exodus 2, and then Exodus 3. And we could spend weeks and weeks just on, or months or years on the story of Moses. A sub-story of the meta-story of God. We're going to do just a few minutes here to give us kind of a taste, a foreshadow. In chapter 1, then a new king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, to whom Joseph meant nothing. Joseph was a descendant of Abraham. So these people of faith who believe that Yahweh is the true creator God, they wind up in Egypt because of a famine. This Pharaoh doesn't know these people, doesn't know the significance of Joseph. And this Pharaoh says, "Look, these Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous than us. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies. They will fight against us and leave the country." So Egypt put slave masters over them to oppress them through forced labor, and they were forced to build Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. That phrase is used twice here. They were worked ruthlessly. This is when something's repeated anytime in Scripture, it is the author's way of being emphatic. It's a use of emphatic exclamation points, exclamation point. They were worked ruthlessly. We're going to see it again here in just the next sentence. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. This is an emphasis to say this was brutal. The Israelites were brutalized in slavery by the Egyptians. Why? Because of fear. How often do we react or make decisions out of fear? This country makes this decision. The leadership is so harsh because of insecurity. Now Moses, baby Moses, is found in a basket in the reeds, born an Israelite, really born into slavery. His mother hides him in the reeds. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, and Moses is essentially adopted into Pharaoh's home and grows as a child to become the prince of Egypt, to become the heir of Pharaoh's throne. How ironic is that? An Israelite. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. Here his people are, slaves, being tortured in this ruthless work. He is the son now, the adopted son of Pharaoh, and he's watching this just oppression. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, two Israelites fighting with each other. And he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" See, there's something of leadership or initiative emerging in Moses here. We see him with this holy unrest that something is terribly wrong. And not only are the Egyptians mistreating us, we're mistreating each other. And so he speaks up, and this is what frightens Moses. Here comes fear again into the story. "Why are you hitting your fellow Israelite?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" And Moses realizes what he had done became known somehow, that he'd killed an Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. Part of this just horror in leadership we talked about in our worship. King Herod, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and his response out of fear. Here comes Pharaoh now. He's so angry. He's trying to kill his own adopted son. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, which is in the deep wilderness. We know today Midian is in the middle of Saudi Arabia. It's just deep desert. Now, I want to pause here because of conflict entering the story. I mean, it's clearly a part of the story. And I want to look again at the elements of story. We often, it's just common to grow up being entertained by stories, loving stories. There's stories we love, there's stories we don't love. These are boring. That's a romantic comedy, not my thing. And we have our own genres of what stories entertain us or educate us without really understanding what makes a great story. The first element that makes a great story is it's really simple. There's a person with a want. Every great story has to have a protagonist, a main character that desires something. The second element of a great story is where conflict enters. You don't have a good story if you don't have good conflict. You get bored. You and I lose interest. Often when we say, I couldn't get it, it didn't grab me. Often it's because there wasn't conflict introduced early enough in the story. Every great story has conflict. And the conflict stands between the protagonist and their dream, the object of their desire. And see, this is where you and I start emotionally attaching to the story. Because you and I have desires, we have wants, and we have conflict. And so maybe this character can overcome their conflict. That's what's happening. That's what's running inside of us when we connect to a great story. Maybe. You know, this is what vicarious means. We're latched onto this character now, this stranger, this person. They don't even exist. This person's a fictional character, and we're on the edge of our seat. Why? Because they're facing something that could prevent them from getting to their desire, their want, just like you and I do. Now, I want to pause here in this list to say there are a couple of hidden core aspects to story that we often don't think about. And this one's kind of hard to get our heads around, and we spent some time on this in week 1. And that is that every great story deals with this reality. No one gets the story they want. No one. No human ever gets to follow the script they write for themselves. And we've all done it. We all have this script. From childhood, our teenage years is where we really kind of become intentional. The college, the career, the money, that relationship, it's going to be perfect. We're going to have a wonderful family. Parenting is going to be fun. We're going to have a house full of laughter. And then people start walking into church and want to go to coffee with Pastor Brad, who's like, what happened? I'm not getting the story I wanted. And then if Pastor Brad's honest and transparent, he says, yeah, and I haven't either. Some of that by my own doing, my own choosing. Mistakes, regrets that I have carried. And some of it's just circumstantial. We live in a broken world. The third aspect of a great story, I've alliterated with C's to help us remember this. This is where the crisis comes in. The crisis is really the ultimate conflict. Great stories have a series of conflicts, and then there's the ultimate conflict called the crisis that leads to the ultimate choice. The character's got to make a choice. It might be selfish, it might be self-serving, they might run and hide, they maybe have courage. And that choice, or those series of choices in the crisis, and the conflicts and crisis, reveal their character. And that's the second hidden core element of a great story, is that a story is simply the journey. It's watching, observing, vicariously attaching to the journey of a character's character. The main character's character is revealed through the choices they make when they face tension and conflict. And then the story concludes with the climax and the resolution that shows, the resolution really shows the consequences of the choices the character made. Back to Moses. Moses runs and hides in Midian, deep in the wilderness. We're told later in chapter 3, it was deep on the far side of the wilderness. He's trying to get away as far as he can. From Pharaoh, from God. Chapter 3. It's in that context where the Lord speaks to Moses. Don't you often think you've got to get your life cleaned up? You've got to get all this mess figured out. That regret, I just need to make amends. If I could clean up my life enough, then maybe I could interact with God. God finds you deep in the wilderness. This is the story of God. When we're in conflict and we're in crisis, we often think we're the least deserving. We're the least ready to talk to God, to face Him. But God in His love and in His plan, that's often where He finds us, deep in the wilderness. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down. This is language to show God not being a God that we have to earn our way up to. Every world religion is about us earning, climbing our way up to God. The consistent, when you look at the story structure of God, he's consistently coming down to us. And we see it even here, long before Jesus physically comes down and dwells with us. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. This is the promised land, which foreshadows our ultimate return to the Garden of Eden again, when Jesus heals the world ultimately. This land is currently the home of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites. I used to make a joke about termites in this, which got so old I stopped doing it, but I guess I just did it again. The Hivites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Okay, you ready? This is a script, unexpected. In Moses' story, in the script that Moses has for his life, this is unexpected. So now, Moses, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now, we learn something about Moses' character by his immediate response and responses. And just the spoiler is, he's not quite ready. He doesn't really have the courage. He's still in running mode, and he's still carrying guilt, and he feels totally inadequate. And then he tries to refer to some kind of speech impediment that he has, and he starts making excuses to God. And it's okay. In a great story, it's okay that the character doesn't yet have the character that we want them to have to become the hero. Because a part of every great story is growth and development and stepping out of where we are now into the character that God's designed us for, the me that I'm supposed to become. Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God says, "I'll be with you." I love this negotiating. Moses is asking a really good question. I've asked this question of God. Wait, what? When Amy and I were dating is when I decided to become a pastor. And she was like, "Oh, God, no, anything but that." I mean, really, she almost broke up with me when I told her I felt like I wanted to be a pastor. I was running from it. It just was not, I really did. I stopped going to church for a number of years, a number of months, because God wanted, how funny is that? God made it clear to me that he wanted me to lead a church, and I hated the idea, so I stopped going to church. It's interesting how we run, and Moses is running, and he's making excuses. Who am I? I'm on the far side of the wilderness, hiding from you. Because of things I've done, because of things I've not done. You want me? Yes. Yes. I'll be with you. I'll do the heavy lifting. I'll do the rescuing. But Moses, this is a principle that humans will eventually learn. I always use people. In my plan, I always use people. This began in the garden when humans were entrusted with planet Earth, maintaining the earth, developing, creating, expanding life on earth. God left that up to us. And it continues. Moses says to God, I love this in verse 13, suppose I go. This is, okay, God, let's just hypothetically, if I go. Moses doesn't have the character yet. He doesn't have the character yet to say, hey, yeah, it's me. Send me. God, I'm so honored. I'd love to go. But that's okay because we're in the middle of the story. And God's calling ends up being conflict for Moses. It's a disruption to his plan. He wants to hide and be isolated and not interact. He tried intervening. He tried doing the right thing, and it went badly. His script now is to just avoid people. And so sometimes conflict is God coming into our plans and saying, I want to use you in a way, and it will really be me and my power working through you, but you need to be available to me. All right. All of that is a setup to where we were going to be 2 weeks ago before we got snowed out late on Saturday night on what I call Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. Since we started here 3 years ago at Lightridge, we have focused at least part of that morning on the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And so I decided on the snow cancellation, like, you know what, it's 2 weeks later, we'll be in February, it doesn't matter. I'm still just going to put this point in front of us. I believe a modern day example of Moses, a modern day Moses-like figure, is Martin Luther King Jr. He points so much, in so many ways, to Jesus and how God works and shapes and grows us, how God changes us through our story, through the conflicts we face, the unexpected turns and twists, the unfair treatment, how God uses those moments in our lives to shape us, to change the world. Maybe changing the world is your effect on the life of a neighbor. Or maybe someone in this room that you don't even know yet. God uses people. He works through stories, and he uses people. Now, a few facts about Martin Luther King Jr. We hit on some. I love studying his life. He was a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, at Dexter Baptist Church until the civil rights movement had grown to a point where he resigned as a pastor in order to devote his full time to the civil rights movement. In 1964, he won the Nobel Prize for his nonviolent resistance. He was honored for his belief that nonviolent resistance is more effective and powerful and creates more change than violence does. And, you and I can picture Martin Luther King Jr. in jail. I had forgotten he'd been arrested and jailed 29 times. In his resistance, in his standing up to trying to change unjust practices, he was arrested, and some of the times he was arrested, it's just crazy. It's just crazy what humans can do to other humans. He was arrested for loitering. He was jailed for loitering, and he was jailed for traffic violations. It's like they would just put anything on him they could to put him in jail. When you look at how every story is about someone's desire, we see this clearly in Martin Luther King Jr.'s story, but early in his story, he wanted to pastor. And this is near and dear to my heart, and maybe this is part of why I honor him and study his life. I relate so much to the decision to pastor. It's not an easy job sometimes, and it's the thrill of my life. I love it. I love my job. I wouldn't do anything else. But some of the decisions that he made early on to lead his family, hopefully in peace, while pastoring a church, got horribly upended and changed through conflict. A series of conflicts, never-ending conflicts, day after day kind of conflict. He did not get the story he wanted. He did not get the story that he scripted for his life. Just someday the law changes and he could vote, and he could lead his family in peace. And boy, do we see in his story the journey of character, someone's character being revealed. The character, Martin Luther King Jr., the character of the story's character being revealed. The decisions you make in your story, in your life, the way you live, the decisions you make, the choices you make, especially when under pressure, reveals who you truly are. That's what really reveals the true you. And we see this in his life. Now, a lot of us are familiar with the Selma Bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, because of Bloody Sunday that happened on March 7th, 1965. It was 2 days later, and that was when the resistance just turned so brutal. It was an ugly, ugly day in American history. 2 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. made his way to Selma to do another march across the bridge. And this negotiating happened where the police and the forces decided that if Martin Luther King Jr., in accepting this mantle to lead the civil rights movement, and this was really the turning point for his life and his leadership, to lead this crowd across the bridge, if they would be nonviolent, the police would stand down. And Bloody Sunday on March 7th turned into Turnaround Tuesday, where Martin Luther King Jr. negotiated turning around on the bridge and going back in peace so that there wouldn't be any further violence. This ended up being a masterful strategic move in America's history. We have a clip of this from the movie Selma. Let's watch. I love that the director, Ava DuVernay, filmed this scene on the actual bridge, Edmund Pettus Bridge. And what's remarkable about his decision to bow in prayer is that it was not only just a nonviolent statement after Bloody Sunday. We're not here for violence. We're here for voting rights. That's what this was all about. He was bowing intentionally. We know this from history. We know this. He made this very clear, to pray, to surrender to God and his authority. This changed so much. It was 9 days later, on March 17th, when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was presented to Congress. Less than 2 weeks later, our nation would take this bill, and so much of it had to do with what had happened the week before. This call that he felt was in God's mandate for him to alter the course of his life and become the leader of the civil rights movement. And he would not back down, he would not stand down, but he would, while standing up against the oppression, he would bow before Creator God. I just think it's a remarkable moment in our history. And this led to the Voting Rights Act being passed. So I'm about to propose something here that, we're such creatures of habit and comfort, and familiarity is the word. I'm going to kneel here. I'm going to follow the example of Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm going to close our time. We're not closing with song today. This is going to be the way we end our morning. And I'm going to kneel, and listen, please don't feel pressure. It's hard to kneel where you are in these seats, I understand. So if you want to join me, maybe just step out into the aisle, or maybe come to the front, or go to the side. But I want to kneel to end our morning. And if I'm kneeling on your behalf, that's fine. I'll just represent you because of the seating here. And I want to say to God, my story, my life has been interrupted by conflict. Conflict that I don't enjoy. There's conflict that I could point to and say, this was heartbreaking. This is conflict that I created. I go back to certain moments of my life. But you meet me on the far side of the wilderness. You're the God that doesn't give up. You're the God that still searches for me and sees my potential and who you want me to become. You're the God that can use my conflict to shape me and mold me into a person that's not only just happy and productive, that actually affects others' lives. Only God. Only you. And so today, Jesus, we enter your story. We're already a part of your story, but we intentionally say yes to your story, to your way, to your plan. None of us have scripted conflict. None of us have scripted crisis within our families, in relationships, financially. Sometimes we want to hold our fists to heaven and blame you and ask, where are you? I thought you loved me. When in reality, you've entered the hurt. You've entered our pain. And you will use it if we allow you. God, you will use our pain, our hurt, our mistakes, our brokenness to become the voice, the arm, the shoulder, the hands, the love, the creator, the artist that you've always intended us to be. So this morning, whatever your wilderness is, it can seem so intimidating. I don't know what God's voice is to you. It sounds like, go to Pharaoh and say to him, I just so strongly urge you to say yes to God. He sees the mistakes. He understands. He's come into our broken decisions. He sees our selfishness. He just wants us to admit it, to own it. He sees the way that person has treated you. He sees your loss and your heartache. And he wants to lead you out of the wilderness into this heroic life, speaking and loving on his behalf. And so, Jesus, we say yes to you. You are the God that can turn ugly into beauty. You are the God who can turn bad into good. And so I let you. And it is the privilege of my life to follow you, Jesus. Thank you for the example of Moses. Thank you for the example of Dr. King. But you, Jesus, are the perfect example. You are the protagonist. You are the hero. Define my story with your own character, I pray. Amen.